So your writing assignment is available because that's due on February 15th, the first writing assignment. And then I'll work on today posting the other ones as well. So if you want to work ahead, you can do that. But just keep in mind, so our first exam and first writing assignment is slotted for February 15th. I'm a little bit behind as far as lectures go. So we'll see. We'll see where we get next week because we have classical and operant conditioning, and I don't know that we can get through all of that today and next week. So we'll see where we're at. I might be pushing the exam back one day, but we'll see. I'll make that decision next week. And just a reminder, we will be in person next week, so no more meeting online. This will be our last online Zoom meeting, unless I hear something different from the university over the weekend. But as of right now, we are returning in person starting next Monday. So our class will be on Tuesday. I believe we are in Douglas Hall. So I will see you all there at 9 a.m. bright and early. So I look forward to seeing you all in person. I think that will be good. It'll be a lot easier for me to learn your names and put faces to names and things of that sort. So please just remember, you do need to upload your vaccine card to Sac State. If you go, I believe it's in your student center. I don't know if it's under the health and safety information, or there might be a separate tab for your COVID vaccine proof, but you do need to have that uploaded into the system. I'm not sure how they're enforcing that. I've had a few students ask me, like, will they check? I know that last semester there were kind of checkpoints where they kind of would, I think they checked on your app, or I'm not sure how they checked. But I'm not sure what they're doing this semester. So just, make sure that information is uploaded so you don't have any trouble getting to your classes. And then just keep in mind that masks are non-negotiable in the classroom, okay? Can we be partially vaccinated? I don't know the specifics as to, like, if you've had your first dose, but it hasn't been 2 weeks, so you haven't had your second dose, or if you've had your first 2 doses, but you haven't had your booster yet. I am not entirely certain what is going to be acceptable and what is not. So I would you can reach out to the psychology department. They will know. Yes, if you have your booster, you're probably fully vaccinated. Like if you have both doses plus a booster. But I think the person who was asking me is basically saying they don't have all of those. Okay, Student Center on Canvas, you'll have a specific amount of time as to when you can get your booster and your vaccine and all that. Deanna, you have your hand raised. Did you have a question?
Yes, I did. So say this is for everybody to answer, but say you already uploaded it for the fall semester. Is it different for semester? You have to upload it again, like the
No, I
vaccine?
don't think so, unless you got, like, let's say you didn't have your booster in the fall and now you have it, you would need to update it.
Okay,
Does that
thank
make
you.
sense? Yeah. So only if something has changed, you need to upload it again. If you've already uploaded it and you had everything, then there's no need to do it again. Stasia, I don't know. I know for faculty, we have to have the booster. We cannot be on campus without the booster. I think the booster is necessary for students as well. Okay, people are saying you have until February 28th to get your booster.
I read online, and last time I tried to sign up to get my booster through like the same place I went through, it said that there had to be 6 months in between my booster shot and my second dose, and it hasn't been 6 months. It'll be 6 months in April, so I don't know how that works.
Yeah,
I think because you're considered not eligible for the booster, then it's okay, right? Because it hasn't been the 6 months.
Yeah.
I would reach out to either the department, or I think there's like a COVID
section in my
thing
section.
online that you can reach out to them and they would answer. But I'm pretty sure that there is a clause in there that says like you have to have the booster as long as you're eligible for the booster, which means you didn't just have. So once you hit that 6 months, you'll have to get it.
Oh,
They
okay.
require you to have it.
Oh yeah, I seen all the chats. Thanks, guys.
Okay, I know this, like all this stuff is so confusing. Things are constantly changing. So I will try to have information for you and provide reminders and things like that as we go along through the semester. Yeah, and the president also does provide a lot of information in his update too. So yeah, so just, I know it's a lot. I know it's constantly changing and everyone's just trying to like figure out what the heck is going on. But that's why I wanted to kind of say something in class today because we are going to be in person next week. So I just want to make sure that nobody's like, I didn't know. I don't know what's going on. Okay. All right. Let me get, oh, I was going to go over the quiz questions real quick. So, okay, let me get there. Okay, so everyone should have their 10 points already there. As long as you took it, like I said, you get the full 10 points. But as we go over these, it would be good if you kind of kept track of, you know, whether or not you got it right or wrong. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Okay. So what is the main reason we have research ethics? There are a few reasons, but what is the main reason we talked about? Does anyone want to say that?
Safety and well-being.
Safety and well-being. Yep, safety and well-being. We do get informed consent. We do debrief participants. But the main reason we even have ethics at all is to make sure our participants are safe. Which of the following statements regarding psychology is not true? Not true.
It relies on intuition as a main source of knowledge.
Yep, exactly. We rely on the scientific method, right? Not on intuition, not on hypothetical constructs and things like that. We rely on the scientific method for our main source of knowledge. Very good. What is the first step in the scientific method?
Identify question of interest.
Yep, that's the very first thing we have to do. We also will formulate a hypothesis and carry out the research and communicate our findings, but the very first thing you have to do that you start with is identifying your question. Very good. Which variable is what the researcher is manipulating?
Independent variable.
Yes, the IV, that's what we're manipulating or changing in the experiment. So what is the variable that's being measured?
Dependent.
The dependent variable. Very good. So independence, the one that we change and we kind of mess with or manipulate. The dependent variable is what is being measured. Very good. If we have a positive correlation between two variables, this means they're changing in the same direction. So they're either both increasing or decreasing. Is that true or false?
True.
True. That is true, right? Positive correlation means they're either both going up or they're both going down. So a negative correlation means that the two variables being investigated are both decreasing. Is that true or false?
False.
False, right. A negative correlation means what? Does anyone want to tell me?
One's increasing while the other one is decreasing.
Yes, so they're going in opposite directions. Very good, right? Negative means opposite directions. Positive means same direction. An experiment usually consists of two groups. These are
Control group and experimental group.
yes, control and experimental. We kind of left off on that in the last class, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. The control group in an experiment is the group that receives the treatment. Is that true or false?
False.
False. The control group gets the placebo or nothing, basically, right? The experimental group is the one that receives the treatment. The control group is just there, so we can compare the changes in the experimental group, right? Who's actually receiving the treatment. So control group does not receive treatment. A researcher is investigating whether giving students more time to study will reduce their test anxiety. What is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable in this example? The independent variable is, we'll start there.
Test anxiety.
That is the dependent variable. Okay, so
Amount of
what is-
study time.
Study time? Wow,
amount of study time is the independent variable. Why? Can anyone tell me why?
Because you're
Because-
measuring
Oh,
the
Go ahead.
test anxiety. You're measuring the test anxiety, not the time.
Correct. And what are we doing with the time? How do we know that's the independent variable?
Because we can measure time.
Yes. And what are we doing with it? Is it always the same time?
you're giving different amounts of time.
Right. We're manipulating it, right? We're changing it. That's the variable that we're doing different things with. Okay. So that's how we know it's the independent variable. Very good. Okay. So independent variable in that example is the time we give them to study. The dependent variable is just what we're measuring. It's their amount of test anxiety. Okay. Good job, you guys. All right. Any questions about any of those? Pretty straightforward. So if you got any of those wrong, just make a note. Make sure that you understand what the correct answers are and all of that good stuff. Okay, so we left off talking about control and why we have a control group, right? If we don't have a control group, we cannot rule out other explanations between the changes that occur in the experimental versus the control group. So we gave the example of if we have a study with 10 people and he gives everyone the same pharmaceutical drug, and then all clients show fewer signs of depression, but we don't really know if it's the drug or not, right? Because there's no control group to show us that without the drug, does depression not change, right? So that's what we're looking at. So when we use control groups and experimental groups, individuals are randomly assigned to each group, okay? So how that works is usually this is done, well, ideally this is done like by a computer program. Experiments that are done in like master's programs or undergrad programs, random assignment is kind of, you kind of do it yourself almost, or you like shuffle the surveys and you just hand them out randomly, right? You don't know who gets what survey and things like that. But ideally, when we're doing, like a large scale, if you're doing like a medical experiment with, experimental drugs and things like that, the random assignment is done and calculated by a computer program. And so we have something called blind or double blind assignment. So blind assignment just means that you as the participant don't know what group you're in, okay? And experiments are always that way, right? Of course, you don't know if you're in the control group or you're in the experimental group because, there'd be a whole host of problems if you knew which group you were in, right? So you don't know if you're receiving the treatment or if you're just getting the placebo, right? No treatment at all. But there's also something called double blind assignment. And what double blind assignment means is that even the experimenter doesn't know who's in what group. Okay. This is done in drug studies. This is done in survey studies a lot. And the way they do this is, if it's like a drug study, for example, the pharmacist, right, those who are making the pharmaceuticals will know which drug is which. But when they give them to the experimenter, they just say drug A and drug B on them. And I've actually done this. So I kind of like not to do with psychology, but it does apply here. So I used to foster kittens. I used to raise kittens who were born on the streets or didn't have a mom, so on and so forth. So that's where my 3 kittens came from. I actually raised 7. And 2 of the kittens I had were really, really, really sick. They had double eye infections and they were probably going to lose their eyes. I mean, they were really, really bad. So the organization that I fostered through, we actually entered them or signed them up to be in a study at UC Davis at the vet hospital there, and they were chosen. And they were a brother-sister duo. And one was one was actually placed in the control group and one was placed in the experimental group. But nobody knew who was what. So I was given all of these drugs. It's actually really cool when they do these studies, but you're given all of these drugs and all of these instructions, and the kittens have like collars on with different colors, so you know who gets what treatment. But nobody knew which one was which. So the little girl kitten, I named her Penny because she would look like a copper penny. Penny got the pink drugs, and then her brother, Hendrickson. I'm trying to remember what I named him because now his name is different. And I know him by that name, but I think I call him Hendrix. He had a blue collar, so he got the blue drugs. But I didn't know if the pink or the blue was the actual drug or a placebo drug. The experimenter also didn't know. Okay, so she couldn't even tell me who was getting the actual treatment versus who was getting, a different treatment. And the only person that knew was the person who made the pharmaceutical. So once the study was completely over, right, and they start assessing the data, then the experimenter is told which one is which. And this is done to avoid any biases that could influence your findings at all, okay? As to whether or not they're working. Now, the study that the kittens were in, it was kind of obvious because the drugs are gonna fix the eyes, and the way they do that so that the kittens still get medicine is they both get medicine, but one of the kittens got like an additional medicine, like the experimental drug. Okay, so they actually both got better. Neither one of them lost their eyes. It was awesome, and it was really cool to participate in something like that and see how this random assignment and double blind assignment actually works when the experimenter doesn't even know who's in the control group versus who's in the experimental group. And so they're assigned to different groups based on chance alone, basically. And when a computer program does this, you just enter in the participants and it just randomly shuffles them and puts them in however many groups you have. Sometimes there's multiple experimental groups, right? There's not always just one experimental group and one control group. That's the minimum that you need. You need at least one of each. But sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 experimental groups and then your control group. And so the computer will randomly assign people to those groups. They should be roughly comparable, but that's also difficult to do because there's so many things that an individual could have, that's different from each group in terms of like learning history, income, socioeconomic status, intelligence, personality type. The computer, isn't going to account for all of those things. You can account for some of those things, but then it's also not random either completely, right? If you're telling the computer, I want, I want 6 of this ethnicity and 7 of this ethnicity and 8 of this ethnicity in one group, and then put the rest in the other group, then it's not wholly random, right? But when you do this random assignment, you also run the risk that the groups are not comparable. So experimenters are always trying to kind of walk these fine lines of randomly assigning, so there's no bias involved, right? You're not cherry picking who is in what group, but also trying to make sure that your groups are comparable, because if they end up completely different, there could be other explanations for why one group performed a certain way versus the other group, right? So you want them all to be somewhat similar. Okay. This is just a quick little illustration of what this would kind of look like, but so you identify your participants, right? You have a group, you randomly assign them, and you'll have 2 groups, right? So you'll have your treatment group, that in this case is group 1. They're going to receive a experimental drug, and then group 2 is the control group. They're not going to get a drug, but they'll probably still be given a pill. It's just a placebo pill, right? There's nothing in it, oil or water or something like that. And that is manipulating the independent variable. Okay, so the independent variable is the drug. right? It's either the drug or the placebo pill. That's what we're manipulating in the experiment. And then we measure the dependent variable, whatever that is, okay? So let's say they're doing a sleep study with the monkeys. One group gets, the sleep pill, the other group does not. And then we measure the amount of sleep they get at night, right? So that would be the dependent variable. And then we'll compare the results of the two groups. Did the monkeys that got the drug for sleep actually sleep better than the control group who didn't get the drug? Did they all sleep the same, even though one group got the drugs and one group didn't? Or, if the drug didn't work, right? If it had an opposite effect, maybe the experimental drug actually caused the monkeys to not sleep very well and the control group slept better, the ones who didn't get the drug, right? So you're going to look at all of the possible outcomes that came from those two groups. Okay. Just some other important terms I want you to be aware of when we're talking about experimentation. So there's something called a confederate. Okay, this is someone who's employed by the researcher who's going to participate in the study, and they pretend to be a participant themselves. Okay, think back to we in the very first, or I guess the second class we had, but the first lecture class, we talked about the Milgram study, right? That was the study where they told participants to shock the person in the other room every time they got a question wrong. Right. The person in the other room who was supposedly getting shocked, that was a confederate. Okay. They were actually part of the experiment. They were not really getting shocked. They were acting, right? They're screaming like, "Ow, let me out. Please stop. This is terrible." Right. They were actually confederate. They were not a real participant. They were not being shocked. Okay. Now the participants thought they were real. They didn't know that. Okay. And that's the whole point. When you have confederates, you don't want participants to know that the confederates are actually working with you as the experimenter. I worked on a study when I was in grad school. It was a rapid eating study. And so we had individuals who had identified themselves as rapid eaters. Now, when we say rapid eaters, I think some people think, oh, I eat really fast. But when I say rapid eaters, I mean like could inhale a huge, 2-hand burrito from Chipotle in about a minute, right? Like just gone. And not that they're like trying to eat fast. It's just they eat really, really quickly. And part of the problem that we encountered was when they knew that we were watching them eat, they would slow down, right? They still ate fast, but they would kind of force themselves to slow down. So what we did is we put a confederate in the room. Okay, so we put another person in the room who they thought was a participant. This person would eat lunch with them, whatever we were providing, because we would provide food like pizza or cheeseburgers or whatever it was. And this person would eat with them, but they were actually an experimenter and they were timing the other participants eating. Okay, so that's what a confederate is. They're part of the experiment themselves, but the participants don't know that. Okay, replication is really important for experimentations. Can we replicate the procedures that we've done and produce the same results? Okay, this is really important because scientific understanding and knowledge is based on accumulated knowledge. It's based on accumulated data over time. Okay, we typically don't just do one study, look at the results and go, done, we found the answer, right? That's just not how science works. And scientific knowledge, we do it again and again, and then another lab will do it and another lab will replicate it. And then we might tweak something and we'll do it again, right? And another lab will do it again and another lab will replicate. So scientific understanding really depends on this accumulated knowledge that we have. So if you conduct a study, the most nerve-wracking thing, and I have done studies like this and I've done experiments, but the most nerve-wracking moment is when you go to do it again. And you're like, fingers crossed, like it's gonna work again, right? Like we didn't screw something up the first time and it just worked by fluke or by accident. Like, hopefully it still works, right? And I've definitely had that happen, even across participants, where we'll do like 5, 6, 7 participants, everything's working, the data looks good, we get to participant 7, and you still are kind of like, oh, I hope it works, because that replication is so important. If you start to get, you know, findings that are kind of all over the place and vary and different, you have found nothing. You can make no conclusions. So we really depend on that replication. It's very, very important. And then significant outcomes are another thing that we focus on, depending on what the experiment is. So in my field, in applied behavior analysis, we don't run a lot of large group designs. We actually do single subject design experiments. And so we don't depend so much on significant outcomes, but any experiment that is looking at statistical analyses of any kind, you are looking for significant outcomes, right? Statistically significant, right? That's what we're looking for, which basically means if there's a difference between the groups, right? So if we find a difference between the control group and the experimental group, how meaningful is that difference? How great is that difference? That's the statistically significant finding. Okay. If you have a difference between the group, but it's kind of a negligible difference, like it's not very large, you probably don't have a significant finding, right? It's not different enough to conclude that what you manipulated resulted in a change, right? A change in the dependent variable. So that's what you're looking for. You're looking for meaningful differences between the two groups. Okay, and that's how you get a significant outcome. And we are looking for those, especially in large group designs in psychology, which that is the majority of the types of experiments that are done are group designs. You're looking for big differences, meaningful differences between the groups. And you find that through, you enter the data in a statistical, like program that you have, and it does all of the analyses and produces those outcomes for you. Experimental bias is a big one, and I kind of mentioned that we do things to avoid experimental bias, but basically they're factors that will influence how the IV, how the independent variable actually affects the DV. So I think we talked about last time, if you need to consider, so if we talk about the example where we give a certain amount of time to students to study, and then we measure their test anxiety, right? Other factors that could influence that were things like temperature of the room, right? Time of day and things like that. But experimenter expectations can also influence that. And so can participant expectations, okay? When we're doing certain studies, so when I was in grad school, we did a lot of our studies on computer programs. I've talked about this before, right? Where people are selecting things on the computer, or they're saying things out loud, right? They're talking to us while they're doing it. And as the experimenter, you want your experiment to work. You're looking for them to say the right thing or select the right thing on the computer. Your bias can come into play. If I'm looking for a specific answer for them to say and they say something close, I could and not in a malicious way, not to like cheat the experiment, but I'm just like, oh, that was a really close answer. I'm going to accept that answer, right? Because your bias will influence what you're looking for within the experiment. To combat that happening in our lab, we would always have at least 2 experimenters in the room. So you have the person who's running the experiment, but you also have another experimenter who's watching everything and making sure that it's being done correctly and the correct data is being taken, right? And that's to counterbalance any bias that you as the experimenter might have. Same thing with participant expectations, right? It can influence how they perform. So bias is something we have to think about. A placebo effect, which you've probably heard. So in a control group, you don't get the treatment or the drug, right? But that group can have what is known as a placebo effect, which basically means they don't actually experience any difference, but because they think they're getting the drug, sometimes you do see some improvement. Now, typically you still don't see as much improvement as the actual experimental group, right? Who's experiencing those chemical properties and changes from the drug. But you might still see the group, the control group, improve slightly, right? Because they are under the impression that they could be getting the drug. So the placebo means no treatment, no drug, right? False treatment. And then there's also a placebo effect, which is the control group slightly improves because they think they're getting the treatment. And we kind of already talked about double blind, but this is just when both the experimenter and researcher don't know who's receiving what treatment, okay? And this completely eliminates any bias, right? I don't know who's getting the treatment. You don't know who's getting the treatment. So we can't even say, oh, this person seems like they're doing better. See, the drug's working, because we don't know who's on the drug and who's not, right? So we're just taking the data and assessing it, but we have no idea who's on what pill or what drug or what treatment. So it completely eliminates all of that bias. Okay, let me pull up the next. Okay, so moving on to classical conditioning. So hopefully you guys kind of read ahead, but this is in chapter 5. And we'll be talking about classical conditioning and operant conditioning over the next, week and a half or so. Okay. So I'm going to show you a few pictures and ask you, what does the sight of this meal result in physically for your body? Okay. Or maybe this movie snack, or maybe a soda, or maybe even like a milkshake or something. You might kind of start to, especially if you haven't eaten breakfast yet, right? It's still pretty early in the morning. You might feel hungry. Your stomach might be grumbling. Maybe even if you already ate, your mouth might be watering. I know I love movie popcorn. It's one of my favorite things. It's so delicious. So even when I see the picture of it, right, I kind of start to go, oh, that sounds really good, right? Your mouth might start watering. You might start feeling hungry. All of these responses that you might be engaging in just from seeing these images are a result of something called classical conditioning, okay? I think I have a funny little video. Let me see if this video works. You probably have seen it, honestly, but it's just kind of a fun little video. Here. Oh, what's happening? There we go. Okay.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct.
I have to reboot again. Wait, do you want an outlet? What do you think? What? Okay. Outlet? Sure. What are you doing? What? I don't know. Mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
So that's just a really, pretty basic but good example of kind of what is going on when classical conditioning is established. And we'll kind of talk about how that works and why it works. And that's exactly what they were doing in that show, in The Office, right? So first, let's talk a little bit about a really simple, basic type of learning. It's called habituation. Okay. This is a decrease in the strength or probability of a reflexive response after a repeated presentation of a stimulus that elicits the response. Okay. It's a lot of big words. Let's break it down, right? Reflexive responses, okay, are things that you are born knowing how to do. No one has to teach you how to do these things. Humans don't have very many of them. Animals have a lot more what we call innate or reflexive responses, okay? But humans do have some. The rooting response of a newborn, right? Looking for milk, right? So they open their mouth and kind of root around, looking for, if they are breastfed, right? They're looking for a nipple. But anything you put near their mouth, if you put your finger near their mouth, if you put a bottle near their mouth, they're gonna automatically turn mouth open to that thing. Okay, it's called the rooting response. That's innate. You're born knowing how to do that. No one had to teach the baby how to look for food, mouth open, and things like that, right? Another thing that humans are born with is what is called the startle response, okay? So if you hear a loud noise, you startle, okay? You flinch, kind of. So what habituation is saying is that when you're presented with something, okay, a stimulus of some kind, you're going to engage in some response. If you're presented with that same stimulus over and over and over and over again, that response will sort of get less, okay? So if a stimulus that is like really loud, right? And I'll give you an example in just a moment. But let's say you're sitting on the couch, it's quiet in the house. This happens to me all the time. I'll be working, it's quiet, the kids aren't home, and then my cat like knocks over a chair in the other room and it makes this really loud banging noise, right? I'm gonna like, what the heck was that, right? I'm gonna startle the first time it happens. Now, if the other two cats are chasing him and then they knock over two more chairs, I'm probably not going to startle as much because it was that first one that kind of made me go, whoa, what's going on, right? But as that same sound happened over and over again, I'm not as startled by it, okay? And that's what habituation is. It means that you get used to it, okay? You habituate to it. It's the simplest form of learning that we have. So here's like an actual example. So let's say the person next to you, let's say, and I've done this to my kids. I'm like, I'm going to do an experiment, we'll be watching TV. We're all really into it. And then I turn and I clap in their face, right? Really loud. And they'll jump, what the heck, mom, right? Like it totally startles them, right? They might look at me really weird, they might get upset, but it startles them. They were not expecting it, and it is a sound out of the ordinary from what is happening in the moment in their environment, right? Now, if you were in a loud room and everyone's clapping, a clap might not scare you, okay? So you have to, everything is kind of dependent on what the environment is that you're in and what you're doing and so on and so forth. But if you're sitting in a quiet room and someone turns and claps in your face really loud, you're going to startle. Now, if they keep doing that, right, if they're doing it over and over and over again, you're not going to jump or startle anymore, right? Maybe the first couple of times they might startle, but after that, they get used to you clapping in their face, okay? And essentially, you habituate to the sound. You learn not to respond to it anymore, okay? And this is a graph of what habituation kind of looks like. So at the top left corner, you're seeing the response, okay? The probability that you're going to startle in the presence of, a loud noise. So the first time that loud noise happens, you're definitely going to startle, right? But so on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, so it's going, from left to right, as you increase the number of times it's presented. So as you increase the number of times you clap in someone's face, we see that graph go down, right? They stop responding to it. They stop startling, okay? And that's habituation. It's when your response gets less and less and less as you're exposed to the same stimulus over and over again, okay? Runners will do this, swimmers will do this. So, there's always like a horn or a bell or a really loud, like a gunshot that goes off right before a race, right? And when you first are learning how to race or learning how to jump off the block, to swim, when you see young swimmers, like kids and things, they'll kind of like flinch, right? They kind of startle when the sound goes off, and then they jump into the pool, right? But over time, and as they compete in more and more and more races, and they practice more and more and more, eventually they don't flinch at the sound anymore. They just dive right into the pool, right? Or they just start running. There's no flinch to that noise. They're waiting for it. It happens and they go. Again, that's habituation. Those people have, gotten used to that sound in that environment. When they're getting ready for a race, they no longer startle at that sound, at that noise, right? So that's habituation. Okay. Classical conditioning is just another type of learning, okay? Learning is a change in behavior that's brought about by some experience, okay? That's what it means to learn. It means that your behavior changes because of past experiences that you have. Okay, and classical conditioning. So habituation is the simplest form of learning that we have. And then now we're going to get into classical conditioning, which is another type of learning. So this is when an association or relationship is learned between two or more stimuli. Okay, so stimuli are objects in your environment of some kind, or they can be an event. So it can be a sound, it can be a smell, it can be like sense of touch, okay? Or it can be actual objects. That's what we mean by a stimulus or stimuli, okay? So I'll use that term quite a lot. So you do need to be familiar with that, but it's basically just saying an event or an object that you're exposed to, okay? So for classical conditioning, you learn an association between two or more stimuli. And a response is elicited, which basically means a response happens, okay, in the presence of a particular stimulus. So Ivan Pavlov is most known. He's the one who discovered classical conditioning, okay? So he's the one that we attribute all of this to. He was conducting experiments with dogs. Now, he was not originally investigating what we now call classical conditioning. He was actually looking at when dogs secrete. So when they, when they salivate in front of food, he wanted to know what substances are secreted that help them digest certain foods. So he was giving them different types of food and then measuring their saliva, the substance in their saliva, to see what chemicals are in their digestive system that help them digest different food, okay? So he was not looking at this classical conditioning thing at all, okay? He kind of stumbled across it by accident, okay? Because he was not looking at that at all. So here's what it kind of looked like. He had a dog hooked up, and they would put these little tubes and hook them up to their saliva glands. And then they would put the food in front of the dog, and the dog would start to salivate, and all of that saliva would drip into the tube, and then he would measure it and look at all the chemical compounds within the saliva and so on and so forth. But what he noticed was that the dogs would actually start salivating before the food was even presented, okay? So he noticed that when the experimenter walked into the room, so they were carrying the food, right? The dog couldn't see the food yet, and that was not in front of him, so he couldn't smell it yet or anything like that. The dogs would start to salivate already. And he started noticing this happening a lot. So he's like, okay, what is going on? Like I was measuring this other thing, but now I'm seeing this happen. The dogs are salivating and there's no food in front of them. What the heck is that about? So he decided to investigate it. Okay. He decided to see, You know, is there another stimulus in the environment that's causing the dogs to salivate? Is that something I can manipulate and control, right? First step of an experiment is identifying your question. Can I do this? Can I manipulate this? Let's find out. So now, every single time they give the dog the food, they're gonna ring a bell. Okay, so they ring a bell, they give the dog the food. And they do this over and over and over and over and over again. Okay. They ring the bell, they give the food. They ring the bell, they give the food. They ring the bell, they give the food. After lots of pairings of this, probably over several days, experimenter walks in and only rings the bell, does not provide the food. And what happens? The bell ring alone results in the dog salivating. Okay. Why is that? Why does that happen? Well, because of classical conditioning, which if we go back real quick to the definition of classical conditioning, it's learning an association between two or more stimuli. So what happened is the dog, okay, the dogs in the experiment learn a relationship between the bell and the food. The ringing of the bell means food is coming. That's the relationship that they learned. There's two stimuli, okay? One stimulus is the bell ring. One stimulus is the food. The relationship between them is they go together. When I hear a bell ring, I know I'm going to get food. Food always follows, okay? So that's the association that the dogs learned. And because of that, when they ring the bell alone, the dog still salivates. Okay, there's still a response that happens even though both stimuli are not there. So we can then remove the food, only ring the bell, and the dog will salivate. I do have a video about this, but I think for sake of time, I'm going to post that under your materials. So you can go on there and watch the video yourself. Or I think I actually already did post it on there. So you can go and watch that. Okay. So now we're going to go over some terminology that you need to know for classical conditioning. This will be on your exam. Hint, hint. So please make sure that if you have any questions as I go through this, that you ask. Okay. So first we have something that is called the unconditioned stimulus, or the US. Okay. This is a stimulus that elicits an automatic response. Okay. When we talk about an automatic response, I'm talking about responses that you don't have to learn. Okay. You're born knowing how to do them. Salivation is one of those responses. Nobody taught you how to salivate in the presence of food or water or like drink, right? That is an unconditioned or an automatic response. Okay. So an unconditioned stimulus is one that results in that automatic response. Okay. Again, it's a stimulus you don't have to learn how to respond to. So food is something. Okay. Food is an unconditioned stimulus. No one has to teach you that to salivate in the presence of food. No one has to teach you that you need food to survive, right? Babies are born knowing how to look for food, right? Mouth open, move their head around. And they also know how to suckle and swallow, like they're born knowing how to do that. So an unconditioned stimulus is one that elicits the automatic response. Okay, it results in a response that nobody has to tell you. Other unconditioned stimuli, a loud noise. Okay, no one has to teach you how to startle when a loud noise happens. Okay, so that's an unconditioned stimulus. No one has to teach you how to respond to it. A puff of air in your face and you blink, right? The unconditioned stimulus is the puff of air, blowing air in your face. No one has to tell you, okay, if a gust of wind blows in your face, you better blink so nothing gets in your eyes. That's an automatic response to the unconditioned stimulus of air being blown in your face, right? So then, of course, you have the unconditioned response, okay? So again, that's a reflexive response. It's something that you're born with that is elicited by a stimulus, okay? So whenever we talk about unconditioned, whether it's stimulus or response, what that means is there's no conditioning required. There's no learning required. Okay, you're born knowing how to do these things. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. And I'll give you specific examples in a moment so you can see exactly how this works. Then we have a neutral stimulus, okay? A stimulus that does not elicit an unconditioned response. So basically what this means is this stimulus is neutral. It doesn't have any meaning, okay? So nothing happens in its presence. Again, I'll go over this in a second. Let me get the terms out and then I'll give you examples. Then we have a conditioned stimulus, okay? So this means it used to be neutral. It used to not mean anything, but after repeated pairings with an unconditioned stimulus, it acquires significance, okay? It becomes a conditioned stimulus. So the conditioned stimulus always starts out as a neutral stimulus. Through conditioning, so through repeated pairings, it gains significance, okay? If we think about the dogs for Ivan Pavlov, okay? Let's go back to this slide. All right. The unconditioned stimulus in this example is going to be the stimulus that no one had to teach the dog to respond to. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what that is? It's an object that we do not have to teach the dog how to respond to.
Food. Oh.
The food. The food. Nobody had to teach that dog to salivate in the presence of food, right? So that's the unconditioned stimulus. There's no conditioning that has taken place yet, okay? The food is the unconditioned stimulus. What's the unconditioned response? So again, this is a response that no one had to teach the dog to do.
Salivate.
Salivate.
Salivate, yeah.
Yes. So the unconditioned response, which is salivation, happens in the presence of the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food. Okay. Now, the first time we ring the bell, it doesn't mean anything to the dog. Okay. It's a neutral stimulus, which means the first time you ring that bell, nothing happens. Okay. The dog has no idea what that means. There's been no pairings with food yet. So it starts out as a neutral stimulus, but after we pair it with food over and over and over again, we pair that neutral stimulus, which is the bell. We pair it with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food. After multiple pairings, that bell now gains significance, right? Now it's called a conditioned stimulus. Because now it's a stimulus that's been conditioned. Now the dog will salivate in the presence of the bell, okay, instead of in the presence of the food. And now it's a conditioned stimulus. Finally, we have the conditioned response, okay? This is the response that occurs in the presence of the conditioned stimulus. Okay, so if we go back to the dog again, when the dog salivates in the presence of food, okay, that's an unconditioned response. No one has to teach the dog to salivate in the presence of food, okay? But after repeated pairings, the bell is now a conditioned stimulus, and the dog will salivate in the presence of the bell alone. But that response, that salivation is different, okay? We had to teach the dog, essentially. We're teaching the dog to salivate in the presence of the bell. We're conditioning the dog to do that. So that salivation is called the conditioned response. It's different from them salivating in the presence of food. Now they're salivating in the presence of a bell, which is something we had to teach them. They had to learn that. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone? Are there any questions or clarifications that you need? Because I know that these terms, they're very similar, right? And it's just like that fine nuance of difference that distinguishes between them. So
I have
you
a
wanna make-
question.
For example of
Sorry, a couple of people are talking. So first someone said, I have a question. Who said that?
I did. I just had a question. So like for conditioned response, can that somewhat parallel like habituation? like repeating?
No. So habituation, remember, is the response gets less and less and less and less. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, in a conditioned response, the salivation doesn't get less and less and less and less. It's just that salivation now will happen in the presence of the bell instead of in the presence of the food.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, someone else was talking too. So who was that?
I was just gonna ask if you can give another example of unconditioned stimulus.
Yes, so let's do some examples. So here we go. Okay. An unconditioned stimulus, a puff of air in your eye. Okay. That's an unconditioned stimulus that results in the unconditioned response of blinking. Okay. Let's say this is going to be like a really obscure example and very strange, but just go with it for the sake of the example. Let's say that every single time, and this does happen, but every single time you go to the eye doctor, they blow a puff of air in your eyes, right? They're taking like a measurement of the health of your eye. If anyone's ever gotten an eye exam, you put your chin in this thing and you look through the hole and it does this really quick, hard puff of air in your eye and you start blinking, okay? So the unconditioned stimulus is the puff of air. The unconditioned response is blinking. Again, no one has to teach you that. The eye doctor doesn't sit you down and say, okay, I'm going to blow a puff of air in your eye and don't forget to blink. Like, you automatically do that, right? No one has to teach you that in the presence of a puff of air in your eye, you have to blink. So that's the unconditioned stimulus. No one taught that to you. With the unconditioned response, no one told you how to do that. But let's say every single time you go, it's the same technician who sits you down at that chair. Okay, it's the same. Let's say at my optician's office, it's a gal, and she's been there for forever, ever since I've been going there since I was a teenager. So now when she walks into the room, I kind of start blinking, right? What happened? Through multiple pairings, she started as a neutral stimulus, right? She didn't really mean anything. But because she's been paired with the unconditioned stimulus of the puff of air in your eye over and over and over and over again, I'm now engaging in a conditioned response where I blink in the presence of this woman. Okay, so before the puff of air even happens, I'm already blinking. I'm engaging in a conditioned response because the conditioning happened, the pairing happened between this lady and the unconditioned stimulus of the puff of air. Now she's a conditioned stimulus, and I engage in the conditioned response of blinking in her presence. Okay, let's do another one. This is kind of similar to the dogs, but the unconditioned stimulus of food in your mouth results in the unconditioned response of salivating. Again, nobody teaches you this. No one tells you, no one sits you down and is like, okay, I'm putting food in your mouth. Don't forget to salivate. That helps you digest, right? Your body automatically does this, okay? So unconditioned stimulus, no one has to teach that to you, the food in your mouth. Unconditioned response is salivation. No one has to tell you how to do that. But other things can get paired with that, right? A McDonald's sign. Actually, for me, I don't like McDonald's. A Taco Bell sign. Okay, it's my favorite fast food. It's ridiculous. But through multiple pairings of eating that delicious burrito and being in the presence of the Taco Bell sign, okay, the Taco Bell sign starts out as a neutral stimulus. It doesn't mean anything the first few times you go. You're salivating because of the burrito in your mouth. But over time and after multiple pairings, now when I see the Taco Bell sign before I have any food, I start to salivate. Okay. The Taco Bell sign has now become a conditioned stimulus, and I'm engaging in a conditioned response of salivation in the presence of the sign. Okay. Let's do a high temperature. Okay. Bright light shining in the eye. It's very similar to blinking, right? Your pupils constrict. High temperatures, you sweat. Okay. Unconditioned stimulus is a high temperature. unconditioned response, you sweat. Okay. Let's say, typically, let's say it's really hot in your office, so you're sweating, and then your boss is always present. Okay, so originally boss may start out as a neutral stimulus. You're sweating, you're engaging in the unconditioned response because of the unconditioned stimulus that the room is hot. Okay, and the neutral stimulus is present, your boss is always there. After multiple pairings of this, you might start sweating in the presence of your boss alone. Okay, even if the room's not hot, right? Even if the unconditioned stimulus isn't there, when your boss arrives, now he's not a neutral stimulus anymore. They're a conditioned stimulus, and you engage in the conditioned response of sweating because boss has been paired with the unconditioned stimulus of a hot room over and over and over again. Okay. We also have, if you're in a low temperature, that's another unconditioned stimulus. No one has to teach you how to respond to that. Your body automatically starts shivering to warm you up. Okay, so that's another unconditioned response and unconditioned stimulus. And nasal irritation, which is another unconditioned stimulus, results in the unconditioned response of sneezing. Okay, so notice for all of these, okay, for all of these unconditioned stimuli and all of these unconditioned responses, the key factor here is that nobody has to teach you these things. Nobody has to teach you how to respond to these stimuli. No one has to teach you how to respond to them. No one has to teach you these responses. Another one that I didn't put on here, but I talked about the rooting response. No one has to teach you that. And the unconditioned stimulus is basically like something next to their mouth, whether it's a nipple or a finger, or like a bottle nipple. If you rub something, I don't know if you guys can see me, hopefully you can, but if you rub something on the corner of their mouth, they automatically turn mouth open to that thing, whatever it is. Okay, that's an unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. Okay. Any questions about this? What time is it? Yeah, I think we'll end here. Any questions, any clarifications? Okay. Make sure you kind of go over those, the US, the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus, make sure you're very familiar with those terms and the differences between them. There will definitely be questions on the exam about those. So. All right, you guys. I hope you have a great weekend. Relax, do something fun.
Thank you, professor. It's an interesting lecture.
Good. Thanks.
Have a good one.
Professor, have a good day.
I'll see you guys on
Thank you.
Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you Tuesday.
Thank you. See you Tuesday.